What's good, motherfuckers? Happy Friday the 13th. It is I, your boy Jay, the man who is here to yap at you about some Friday the 13th shit. It's on my brain, of course, because it is Friday the 13th. I'm also gearing up to live stream a feature length commentary for Friday the 13th, part 3. And Brian from Last Movie Standing and Chase from AV Pop Culture are going to join me tonight because it's Friday the 13th, baby, at 10 p.m. EST. That's Eastern Time, dog, because I live on the East Coast and I ain't staying up too late because I got young kids. They're going to wake me up early Saturday morning and be like, Daddy, I want Fruity Pebbles. And so if I'm up till 3 in the morning with Chase and Brian, then I will suffer the next morning for it, and my daughters will see to that. So it's going to be on this very channel. I'll come back tonight for that. But to get myself in the mood for tonight, and hopefully you as well, if you're watching this, I thought that I would talk through some of the thoughts that I've been having lately about the Friday the 13th franchise. It's a film series that I continuously revisit, especially in the summertime. I think the summertime is the right time thanks to the camp vibes. But I will watch a Friday the 13th movie even in December, for instance. If there's a Friday the 13th in December, if the calendar says 13 and the day is Friday, I'm watching a Friday the 13th movie that night. And that's all there is to it. I won't be talked out of it. That's all I can watch on a Friday the 13th. All I can watch is a Friday the 13th film. Um, there's just something cozy about them as a franchise, which is why I love them so much, particularly the first four. The first four Friday the 13th movies are like comfort food of horror movies. They're very cozy. There's something, maybe it's the rustic setting, the wood cabins, the campfires. I mean, what am I doing down here? I set up my whole studio instead of having like racks of movies behind me because they're over there. I've got the fireplace behind me. I've got a big leather chair. I've got wood paneling on all the walls. I mean, this studio that I'm in right now is definitely just like a cabin that Jason Voorhees would kill me in. This is definitely the place that I would be murdered in by Jason Voorhees looking around. I mean, I got a little bit of brick back there. I got a fireplace, and then I got nothing but fucking wood and like an old rug. I got like a bearskin thing over here. Jason Voorhees is definitely going to burst in through that wall like the fucked up Kool-Aid man with a machete in his hand and start fucking hacking me to pieces right in front of your very eyes tonight on our live stream. Who knows? But I have a nostalgia at any rate for that sort of texture of things, the wood, the campfire, the pine trees, the dirt, the lake. They're very textural in a way that not a whole lot of other movies are, in my opinion. There's something about the look and the feel, especially of those early Friday the 13th films. It feels like you're kind of rolling out of the 70s and like into the very early 80s. And unlike with part 7 or part 8 of Friday the 13th, the first couple of Friday the 13th, they come out in the very early 80s. And the thing about the really early 80s is the 80s hadn't quite become the 80s yet, right? They hadn't found their vibe yet. By 88, 89, you know exactly what the 80s vibe is going to be. People living in 1988, 1989, they knew they had experienced enough of the decade. Pop culture for the decade was more or less already shaped, already cemented. But in those early Friday the 13th films, I mean, there's still something that feels very almost like real in the sense that a lot of the locations they're really shot in, actual towns and facades of real buildings. So it had a great feel to those first several films. And I think it is a nostalgia for those decades gone by, that sort of post 70s, real early 80s vibe of those, especially the first two Friday the 13th. I feel like they really nail that because of when they were produced. And these, of course, are the films that I grew up watching on television. So, the stuff that had been released and that had been available to air on TBS or USA or something like that on a Friday night or Saturday night, it was those first maybe 4 or 5 or even 6 Friday the 13th I, of course, did watch them on TV, edited, since I was young. And my parents in the late 80s were not renting horror films for my little ass. So I wasn't getting to see the shit unedited. I was watching it on USA, one of these late night things. They'd come on late and I would at least try to tape them. So, there's that level of nostalgia. It's presenting an older time period, a time period gone by. That's not really possible anymore. I mean, the wonder of those first couple of movies is that the Jason thing is like a legend. There's no internet, there's no computers, there's no laptops, there's no cell phones. And part of that period is that people are somewhat vulnerable. There is a little bit of an information gap. You can't just call the cops with a little glass square in your pocket. You are, if you're out in the woods, you are kind of fucked. And so, there's that. There's the aspect of the late 70s, early 80s there. But then, I'm an Eagle Scout. It's probably tough to believe if you've heard my language on this channel and some of the jokes that I make, but I am an Eagle Scout. And so I spent a lot of time at camps in the summertime. So that's like another layer of nostalgia for me that kind of makes these films very comfortable for me to watch, for me to put on. If I need background viewing, I mean, this is something that I'll throw on in the evening if I'm working on something. I don't really want to pay attention to what's on there. Friday the 13th, and it's usually one of the first four Friday the 13th are going in the Blu-ray player. And that is because the nostalgia does fade for me a little bit as the series goes on. Again, I have a lot of nostalgia for the first several, but then as time goes and the series becomes progressively more recent, then I have a lot less nostalgia. 5 and 6 are still pretty nostalgic, but they're starting to veer away from that like smaller scale of the first several. And with these entries, the moneyed interests of franchise filmmaking start to take over. I mean, yeah, they made a part 3 and a part 4. They were interested in making more money, but with 5 and 6, it's really like, okay, let's sell all the way out because we were supposed to be done with part 4. Part 4 was supposed to be it. But the fact that we're back a year later with part 5 really just tells you, hey, we're selling out and we're comfortable with that. We're good with selling out. And so I lose a little bit of that. We'll come back to the franchise. I got more thoughts on the franchise filmmaking in a second. I'll put a pin in that, and I'm going to come back to bitch about franchise filmmaking a little bit more when I've talked about some of the other Jason movies. Now, Jason Goes to Hell was the first entry that I saw when it was like new. Jason Goes to Hell had only been out on VHS for, I don't know, a short while. By the time I got my parents to rent it for me. So it was still fairly new. I didn't see that one in theaters. I was still a little young for that, but after Jason Goes to Hell, every other entry that came after that, I was legally an adult for the rest of the franchise. Being in my 20s when Jason X released, Freddy versus Jason, I was still in my 20s when the remake came out. So, I was an adult for all of those, and you don't have the same nostalgia. Watching something as an adult, you can develop some nostalgia for it, for sure, but I think it's definitely not the same as when you're a kid, when you're 8, or when you're 10 and you're like watching Friday the 13th part 6 with your cousins and you're up way too late, but your parents out of town and they left you with your fucking aunt and uncle who don't give a fuck, and you're watching that poor lady get her head smushed into the inside of the fucking Winnebago or whatever the fuck that was, and her face appears on the outside. It's good stuff, and there's no recapturing that. You can't watch a fucked up horror movie with an 8-year-old's eyes as an adult again. There's no going back, unfortunately. So, as such, I'm much less likely in my own life to revisit any of the entries in the series outside the first 8. I hadn't even seen Jason Goes to Hell or Jason X for like at least 12 years. Jason Goes to Hell, I might not have seen since the 90s, until Arrow put them both out on 4K. And I've recently rewatched them since Arrow put them out. And I got a little bit of a hot take. They're both kind of pieces of shit, mostly in a fun kind of way, but they're definitely kind of shitty films. They're not great, particularly in the same way that the first 3 or 4 are like legit, like good, entertaining films that are even maybe not perfectly made. They were lower budget and the time, but there was a lot of ingenuity and there was a lot of artistry that went into like crafting the makeup and stuff. Tom Savini being involved and such, like with part 1 and 4 at least. So, I don't think that Goes to Hell and X are great at all. I mean, I don't know. They're not great. Jason Goes to Hell would have been a lot better, more enjoyable at least, if it wasn't supposed to be a Friday the 13th movie. If it had been like a different, like not part of that franchise, I actually think it would be a lot more of an enjoyable film, because then it's not married to what came before. And Jason X is just pretty fucking dumb. It's a franchise with a crazy arc. It starts out so grounded in reality. There's really nothing about part 1 that couldn't actually happen. But by the end of the franchise, like, Jason's a zombie who survives into the far future and winds up going into space. And it's like, who the fuck is coming up with this shit? It was one thing to tell a story about a bereaved mother who's suffered a lot since her son died, and she is, she's suffering from depression. She's suffering from audiovisual hallucinations, which is quite apparent by the end of the film. She's obviously got legitimate psychiatric problems that are realistic, that are real psychiatric issues. People get admitted into psychiatric institutions for inpatient stays for things like audiovisual hallucinations, homicidal ideations, shit like that. And she was demonstrating clearly all of these very realistic mental health issues. That's very realistic. It's very believable that a character who experienced the loss of her son would be so traumatized. And then, fast forward a couple of decades, and like now, Jason is just murdering computer simulations in outer space, and that's cool. It's cool. Hey, look, it's a computer simulation with titties. I'm gonna kill her now. It's just wild that it took such a 180-degree turn from what was like a very grounded and very realistic beginning to, like, yeah, the zombie in outer space, dog. Like, what can I tell you? It is what it is. You got to think Jason Voorhees makes it pretty far for a severely mentally handicapped kid who was supposed to have died in 1957. This motherfucker wasn't even supposed to have lived long enough to see the moon landing. Come to find out, he's been chopping people up in the woods before fighting a psychic broad, taking a trip to New York City, fighting Freddy Krueger in his dreams, then being frozen for several hundred years so he can fly around the fucking galaxy a little bit. It's very strange, but we're here. This is the timeline we live in, and that is why I love the first four. I have a lot of love for the first four, but maybe a little bit less so once we start branching out into. Yeah, I love 5 and 6 too. Don't get me wrong. The first four just have that cozy feel, that sort of realistic, like it's just this little corner of the world. It's just this tiny little corner of the world in the woods in New Jersey near Camp Crystal Lake. And the world is totally normal and it keeps turning. And whatever you're doing in your town, Atlanta, Miami, LA, whatever you're doing in your town, in your suburb, you're fine. But if you just venture into this tiny corner of the world, there's like a lot of like it really sparks my imagination that like you could just go off into the woods and discover this whole different experience that's full of terror and full of horror, violence and shit like that. And it's like that's right out there in the woods. It has a more realistic and kind of a frightening feeling for me because of that. As you start to get away from that, I think it loses a lot of that, like that charm that you just wander into the backwoods and like part of our world. You're at home in the suburbs of Atlanta playing Nintendo one day, and you take the wrong car ride out to the woods to camp the next. All of a sudden, you're in that man's fucking neighborhood, and he's gonna fuck you up. I also find that the Friday the 13th movies are a little gimmicky when you think about it, and not just part 7 and 8. Part 7 and 8 are obviously gimmicky, and you know what I'm talking about, but I think they all have a little bit of gimmick to them. So bear with me. Part 1, obviously, it has a gimmick in that the twist is that the killer is Jason's mother, an unassuming old lady, like a 60-year-old broad, is the slasher at a time when it really feels like slashers were like male adults escaping some psychiatric institution or some shit like that, like Halloween. There's something about a male adult that is kind of frightening, like a dude who's 6'2" and 220 pounds could fuck you up if he wanted to. Like, he's got the size and he's got the physical strength that if he starts stalking you and coming after you, you're going to be hard pressed to fight back against him. But in some ways, the little old lady really works. Like, she's not intimidating, she's not scary, and precisely for that reason, people don't run away from her. You can come upon her in the woods, as a homeboy does when he finds her in the woods. He's like, "Oh, what are you doing out here?" He's not afraid of her at all. Then she fucking stabs him. If that had been Michael Myers, some big dude who's 6'3", he's wearing a mask and he's holding a knife or some shit, and you wouldn't have gotten near the guy. You'd be like, "What the fuck are you doing out here?" And you would have run. But the old lady can get close to you. She could be like, "Oh, I'm cold," and then fucking start doing the stabby stabby before you even fucking know it. At the same time, as I mentioned, a 60-year-old lady is not going to win any tussles. So she can't engage in any direct confrontations. And as soon as she does, she gets decapitated. And that's essentially her downfall in part one, is that she starts to reveal her hand at the end to Alice. Alice is able to fight back, and she ultimately loses, because the thing about being a 60, 65-year-old lady is you're a 60 to 65-year-old lady. There's a bit of frailty that comes with that. And that's unfortunate, but it's true. Now, part two has the gimmick of bringing back Jason as the killer. Jason was supposed to have been dead in the first one. He was dead doornails, but they bring him back. They give some fireside exposition at the beginning of the film that explains that his body was never found. So maybe he's still out there. So that's what happens. Somehow he's remained hidden in the woods and never returned to his mama for 20 plus years. His mama would not have been visiting those woods a whole lot in those 20 years. So unless he followed her home, he would not have seen her age for those 20 years. So thus, he probably wouldn't even recognize her. He wouldn't have followed her home, because then they would have simply reunited and all of the bloodshed would have been avoided. So I don't know how the hell Jason recognized his mama's head. That's anybody's guess. So part two doesn't make a ton of sense, that he's like out for revenge for killing his mama, because it's like, how did he even know that was her? And anyway, who cares? Part three obviously has the 3D gimmick. That's a huge gimmick. This is like the gimmick of all gimmicks, practically. It's like you got to wear glasses in the theater to watch this stupid shit. And then, of course, that influences a lot of shots. A lot of the way the movie was filmed was to take advantage of that 3D appearance of objects on screen. So there's a lot of like really kind of ham-fisted, like the kid's holding the baseball bat and it's like right up on the camera. And part three also has, because of the 3D shit, it has that very ambitious, in my opinion, head crushing scene where Rick's eyeball flies out like towards the camera. But it's a moment that surely looked better on VHS. In HD, you can see like the wire that pulls the eyeball out, and the head just looks really fake. It's an example of like an ambitious practical effect that I have to give them credit for. That ambition, wanting to do that on screen, wanting to make an eyeball fly out at the audience in a 3D film. I'll applaud them for the idea, for the ambition, but the execution it's one of those things where you see it, it's not going to look great in 4K either. You know, it's going to look very, very fake. A lot of these effects are just not going to age very well up into some ultra high def formats, because even in the 1080p, it's abundantly clear that there's a wire attached to that fake eye that's about to pull that thing out. Pretty gimmicky, in my opinion. Part four has the final chapter gimmick, and it's not the last time they're going to do that either. It was advertised as a conclusive end to the series. Jason is quite definitively killed at the end. They show him sliding down his head, fucking sliding down the machete with blood and gore and viscera, and then fucking, what's his name, Tommy Jarvis, hacking Jason up with the machete and shit. You don't get to see the pieces, but you have an idea that, you know, he starts whacking at the guy. And I mean, it's a wonder he didn't fully decapitate Jason, but Jason's got his head back in part six, so whatever. In part five, you got the Scooby-Doo gimmick. The killer is eventually unmasked, you know, like the end of a Scooby-Doo episode where they got the guy all tied up and then they pull the mask off him, and the gang is all like, it was old man Roy all along. So it was like Roy Burns, and that pissed everybody off, but whatever. I mean, once you get past it, it's a nice sleazy slasher movie with some very nice nudity and stuff like that. So, part 5 is still pretty good, but it's got that gimmick of like, we want to make more money, but also we killed Jason very definitively in the last film. How are we going to make more money from this franchise? And they hadn't introduced the paranormal, supernatural shit yet, which they do in part 6. It has the Universal Monsters gimmick. Jason is brought back to life like Frankenstein's monster hit by lightning. So the gimmick here is like it's paranormal, and suddenly the franchise has a supernatural element that it lacked for its first 5 entries. I was just saying how grounded and realistic the first one is, since it's all based around mental illness that occurs post trauma, and all of the mental illnesses that Jason's mother Pamela Voorhees exhibits in part 1 are all perfectly realistic psychiatric disorders. But now we've got lightning bringing Jason back to life. It goes without saying that even a cursory high school level familiarity with biochemistry will completely ruin the idea of undead Jason and zombies, because you need a heartbeat to circulate, and you need respiration, and you need to eat and drink. You need to bring in nutrients in order for your body to move, for me to like move my arm and my mouth and generate sound and shit like that. Your body cannot generate ATP. It's necessary for any of the kind of work, even just your brain, like thoughts running through your brain. Forget about ambulation, walking and murdering people and swinging a machete. You need ATP for all of that. You need ATP for nerve impulses. You've got to move ions against a concentration gradient, and you're only doing that with ATP. So really, like you've got no cellular metabolism in death, and without cellular metabolism, you just don't have mechanics for doing things, Jason things, stalking young people and killing them while they're having sex. I mean, Jason or any other zombie moving while being clinically dead and partially decomposed, like actually missing some of the machinery that is necessary to like lever your arm to do something. You can't swing your arm without a muscle contracting to move that arm. So it's like driving a car that has no gas, no oil, no transmission fluid, not even any coolant, and that is also missing half its engine, its steering wheel, and 2 of the 4 tires. It's not going to work in that state. At least in Jason X, they used the nanobots to like bring him, rebuild him kind of. And it's science fiction, but at least they explain kind of how he's able to move around as Uber Jason, but they're not realistic at all. I do love part 6 though, and I do love zombie movies. It's bullshit. Anyway, part 7 is of course well known for its gimmick. It's Jason versus Carrie. Much has been said about that. The final girl is equipped with these paranormal abilities that make her uniquely suited to fight back, where most of the final girls have to run. Some of them get a few licks in with the machete or the axe to the head from part 3, but by and large, they're very ineffective in fighting Jason in any man-to-man confrontation. Really, the best bet is to run, to try to escape, and get away from the guy, because that's your best possibility of survival. But if you're a telekinetic bitch, you can move shit around with your brain and do cool shit with your mind powers. Then now you're able to kind of fight him and still sort of keep a safe distance. So it becomes kind of an interesting mashup. Part 8 is also well known for its gimmick. Jason goes to New York City. It's no longer is Jason confined to the woods, where his massacre will be by necessity limited by the low population density. Now he's got a city full of millions of people, literally millions of people to murder, and he is invulnerable. I mean, taken to its logical conclusion, I mean, he could be like mowing through New York over the course of days and even weeks, and like killing so much of the population that you get the National Guard coming in. I mean, it's no wonder that he was on the FBI's radar by the time you get to Jason Goes to Hell. I always like part 8 because he punches a dude's whole fucking head off. Even if it was done earlier and better in the film Cellar Dweller, I still like any movie where a guy gets his head punched off. Jason Goes to Hell relies on a similar gimmick to part 4. It's billed as a conclusive end to the character. So, we're sold a bill of goods. This is it. This is the end. It's done after this. Bull fucking shit. These motherfuckers came right back to make more money with Jason X several years later, like 8 or 9 years later. So it also leans on another gimmick of blowing Jason to smithereens in the opening scene of the film. It's a bold choice to take your main character, the main draw of this franchise, and completely explode him in like the first 10 minutes. So it's not an entirely effective choice, but it is a bold one because now Jason has to move back and forth between all these other characters, and it really doesn't work very well. It always bugged me too how Jason just fucking comes back in Jason X. There's no real acknowledgement of anything that came before Jason X. They essentially finished the franchise with Goes to Hell so definitively that in any other installment, and there's only 3 after Jason Goes to Hell, but none of those 3 bother to make any mention of the events of Jason Goes to Hell. They're all just kind of independent things that more or less ignore any specifics of the canon that come before. So really, Jason Goes to Hell is the movie that I blame for spoiling any vague sense of continuity this franchise had. I mean, this franchise it wasn't a lot of continuity. I mean, Jason goes from being dead in part 1 to being kind of a hairy hillbilly redneck, feral redneck in the second one, to being bald and hairless, but still pretty feral, maybe slightly more sadistic and kind of smiling and enjoying his murder spree in part 3. In part 4, he looks even more twisted and fucked up and like purple and shit. And so, yeah, there's a lot of incontinuity, but there was still at least a little bit. They would try to pick up from where the last movie left off and try to acknowledge what kind of came before, at least a little bit. Jason Goes to Hell just threw all that out the window, and you'll never see any continuity with the original 8 ever again for that reason. So Jason X is Jason in space. That's all gimmick again, just like Jason 3D. It's 100% gimmick. There's a little payoff here, but mostly it's pretty retarded when you scrutinize it. Like, why did the nanobots give him a sci-fi hockey mask and the metal arm and leg? We've only ever seen them rebuild organic tissue. Then this motherfucker comes back looking like Jason fucked RoboCop and had a kid. Taking him out of camp really didn't work well for Jason Takes Manhattan either. So I don't know. It doesn't work too much for me here either. Freddy versus Jason has the gimmick of finally combining the franchises into a mashup that, again, ignores all continuity, but at least it finally gives us, the kids who were raised on Nightmare on Elm Street being over here and Jason being over here, and they've got their own silos, and never the two shall meet. Finally, the two shall meet. And so, even though I was an adult when that one came out, it's my favorite of all the post Paramount Jason movies because it mashed up these two franchises that I just watched the shit out of as a youngster. So, it's still a lot of fun to watch. For my money, the remake is probably the least gimmicky of all of the Friday the 13th films. It does try to return to the more grounded story of Jason becoming a killer when he witnesses his mom's decapitation. And you could tell they're taking a lot of inspiration from those early films that I have already professed to be my favorite. They're the best in the series, in my opinion. And so, with the remake taking inspiration from those, and not so much Jason in Space or Jason Goes to Hell or Jason's a Zombie now, it did feel like a welcome callback to those earlier films, despite not having that nostalgia piece because they did move it up to the present day. It doesn't have that nostalgia because you're seeing like 2000 and it's like 2008, 2000. What year was that? 2008, somewhere around there. You're seeing this like that 2008 kind of fashion and language and like colloquialisms and stuff like that. So it's not as, I don't know, it's not as quaint to me as those earlier ones. So I'll always revisit the early 80s ones because they're authentic in a way to that time period that I think the remake wasn't really trying to be. I mean, they weren't trying to do an 80s movie, but they were taking inspiration from that. So, I do like the remake. But if the Crystal Lake TV show ever materializes, I do expect it to follow the vein of the remake. I would be very surprised if there was any like supernatural, like zombie Jason, paranormal shit. I would be very surprised if they include any of that. And if they do, it's going to feel like jumping the shark, just like it did in the film franchise. Like, unless you start with the paranormal shit in the very beginning, when you introduce it in the 6th film, it very much feels like jumping the shark. You've run out of ideas. You're really trying to milk this thing. There is no longer any creative spark here. You're really just, this is about making money, and you're bringing this character back to make more money. And while I like this franchise quite a bit, it is a great example of the downside of franchise filmmaking. I told you we'd come back to franchise filmmaking. So parts 2, 3, and 4 are very, very similar films. They cover a lot of the same ground, both literally and figuratively. I mean, he's basically stalking the same, square mile or so. They even pick up immediately after the previous entry ends. So there's really some diminishing returns with that type of filmmaking where, they're almost interchangeable. Killer survives, new teenagers show up, killer proceeds to dispatch them. How many times can they show Jason murdering a horny teenager before we've seen it all? I'm amazed that they were able to stretch the concept as long as they did with parts 2, 3, and 4. On the other hand, fans of the series do have certain expectations. After a few entries, you come to expect something of the series. Transitioning to a new killer, for example, was cool in part 2, right? No one complains about how, oh, I wish it was Pamela. Everybody's cool with Jason becoming the killer in part 2. But by the time you get to part 5, the idea of a new killer subbed in for Jason is widely rejected and lambasted by fans. Fans expected the Jason character to do all the killing. And when they got Roy, they were upset about that. That was a little bit of a bait and switch. And they were promised Jason, and instead they got Roy, which is like, no, we got Jason at home. Jason at home is Roy. Same thing with him fighting Carrie and going to New York and then outer space. The wild swings upset the longtime fans by changing things to such a degree that it doesn't even feel like the same franchise anymore. It doesn't even feel like the same continuity anymore. I mean, Jason X feels like a completely different franchise and continuity compared to part 2, for instance, the first one that he appeared in as a killer. And that cuts to the heart of making sequel after sequel. I mean, any film series, not just Friday the 13th, but any film series, MCU, I mean, anything, Saw, any franchise that has many sequels, you can either do more of the same and people will lose interest and complain that it's getting stale, or you can go off in some new direction. You can do something that's not the same at all. You go 180 degrees and you wind up in space. Ultimately, the fans feel like maybe it doesn't fit. Jason Goes to Hell, for instance, is such a poor fit for the rest of the series. And I respect some of the bold moves that they made, but it feels like it would have worked better as its own thing. And they shoehorned Jason in at the beginning and the end. But what they really had was a story about contagiousness of evil. And I think that's kind of explored in zombie movies as well, because zombie bites are contagious and you can become a zombie by being bitten by a zombie. And so, it wasn't exactly new ground by the time Jason Goes to Hell comes out, but even still, it felt like they were kind of exploring how some evil can be passed on, and it becomes a metaphor for trauma, a victim becoming a victimizer through trauma and that experience and stuff like that. And it could have been a cool comment if it hadn't been like shoehorned into a Jason movie. So I think it would have worked as its own thing. I think the last thing I want to say is that if you are like me, collecting the Blu-ray steel books that had the cover art on them, they did for the first 4. I think we're probably not going to see any more of those. I think because over the last couple of years, the landscape of collection has just gone so much towards 4K. I don't think we're going to see any more of those. I think we'll eventually see Paramount release all of the first 8 in 4K, probably in separate releases. We might get a box at some point, but I think Paramount does the first 8 on 4K eventually over the next several years, because that's what the collectors, I mean, the people buying physical media now are discerning collectors who want a 4K format. And so that's what they're going to give us. I think the Blu-rays are done. I think, the Shout Blu-ray set is still in production. It's still widely available. So you can still get the Friday the 13th movies in a very fine a Blu-ray set that's got some awesome special features in it. So the idea of putting these out again in Blu-ray Steelbook when the 4Ks are waiting, I think that's done, which is unfortunate. I was hoping to collect all of them, at least the first 8 in those Steelbooks that had the original cover art on them. But I welcome the 4Ks. The Part 1 and Part 2 4Ks were great. I welcome 4Ks for the rest of the series. I don't think we'll get a box set like what Scream Factory did, not for a long time at least, because it's obvious that Arrow has the rights to the post-Paramount Jason films. They'll be releasing them on 4K, and the only way Shout gets to put out a 4K box set that is like the successor to their Blu-ray box set is if Arrow's rights lapse and Scream manages to acquire them in the future. So it'll be a while before we see a box set of like all of the Friday the 13th and Jason films like the one that Scream Factory did. So anyway, I think we're going to see more 4Ks over the next several years, though, as individual releases, and then maybe the first 8 will get bundled together on 4K a couple years down the road. Anyway, I hope this brief discussion helped to get you in the mood to watch Friday the 13th Part 3 with us tonight. Myself, Brian from Last Movie Standing, Chase from AV Pop Culture. We're going to be watching Part 3 to celebrate that today is Friday. It is the 13th of June. Friday the 13th is today. It's the only Friday the 13th in all of 2025. So we got to get it. We got to get it tonight because you got to wait till 2026 for another Friday the 13th to come around, dog. So we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate tonight. You can watch along with us on YouTube. Please do. I do have to cover the video up. The video will be over here. It'll be like in this region of the screen. I'll be playing the movie, but it'll have like a partially transparent cover over it. That is so that YouTube doesn't yank our live stream down. Unfortunately, they have a problem with copyrighted material and titties. So, I can't show the whole thing, but, you can kind of watch around. But your best bet, I think, is to load up the Blu-ray, press play at the same time as us. We'll count down when we start the thing, and then you can start the thing at the same time, and you can have our audio going as you watch the film uncovered on your device. Of course, on my Patreon, right down there, I will release an uncovered version of the commentary. Of course, it won't be live. So in order to join us live, you either have to deal with the cover or you have to watch it on your own on a separate device. But that usually works pretty well for most people. So, you're a big boy. You're going to figure it out. And, you can do what you want. You don't need me to tell you what to do. You do what you want, my love. Anyway, peace, my friends. I hope I see you fuckers tonight. Adios.